Hi, this is Jose Martinez with First to Pass Real Estate School. Wanted to talk to you guys today about the difference between freehold and non-freehold estates. Right, the difference between the two of them. There's a lot that goes into both of these types of estates, right? Freehold estate is a form of ownership being transferred, where non-freehold estates are transfer of possession only. All right, so let's start with freehold estates. Transfer of ownership. You either have fee simple or you have a life estate. Okay, so fee simple, also known as absolute, fee simple absolute, is the most comprehensive form of ownership. Right, this gives you the right to pass on to your heirs. It will be being passed on to somebody's heirs, as you'll see when we get into concurrent forms of fee simple estates. Not everybody has the right to pass it on to their heirs, but the estate itself in the form of ownership does grant one of the owners the rights to later pass it on to their heirs. There is right of survivorship in concurrent fee simple estates. But let's go ahead and get started with life estates, and we'll go back to fee simple. So there are two forms of life estates. You have an estate in reversion, and you have what is known as a remainder estate. And the primary difference between the two of them is where it is transferred upon the death of the person who has been granted the life estate. So let's start with an estate in reversion. An estate in reversion, upon the death of the person who is granted the life estate, it reverts back to the original grantor. So for example, if I were to leave my mother an estate in reversion, I were to purchase a home with her and set it up as a life estate in reversion, upon her death, it would revert back to me or my heirs according to my will, or if I die intestate with no will, through descent, right? So why would I set this up? Well, I have siblings, right? And I bought mom's house, and upon her death, it would automatically revert back to me. I don't have to have a conversation with my brothers, for example, about mom's house and why I'm the only one that's entitled to it, being that I purchased it for her. So that would be a life estate in reversion. Now let's talk about a remainder estate. There are also subcategories now to remainder estates. It can either be vested or contingent, but a remainder estate pretty much goes to a third party that is named. Whether it is vested or contingent depends on the wording used. So let me give you an example of a remainder estate. The remainderment is, again, the person who would be receiving the remainder estate. And that remainderment, again, can be vested or contingent. But let's go into a real life example on remainder estates. A gentleman becomes widowed. Let's say if he was widowed, he had tenancy by the entireties, right, with his ex-wife, who is now an ex-wife because she passed away. So now he owns this property, fee simple, in severalty, under his name only. Several years go by, and he goes, we'll say, to a medical appointment and runs into another widowed lady. We'll say she becomes his lady friend. They start spending a little bit more time together, and he falls in love with her. She was living with her kids, and because of the transportation, they weren't spending so much time together. So he moves her into the house, and they live together. Hence, I've never used the term here that they are married, right? So they live together in this way, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever you want to call it, for the next 6 or 7 years. It could be 20, it doesn't really matter. He falls ill, and he's given a short time to live. Well, he doesn't want now to move her. She's elderly as well. Her having to go back and live with her children, so he grants her a remainder estate. And he grants her the life estate, and it's a remainder estate because upon his death, he wants it to go to his grandchildren. Well, if he were to leave the remaindermen as grandchildren, then it would be contingent. That means there's current grandchildren now, and maybe any that are born after his death and before the death of his girlfriend, right? If he would have named the remaindermen as his current grandchildren, such as Juan, Louis, and Mary, for example, and his children would have other children, they would be left out of that estate, right? They would not be remaindermen, as he had named, vested his grandchildren that were currently alive. So in this type of situation, it's best to leave it contingent, and that's why it's available in such a form where he can just name his grandchildren, right? So once she passes away and it transfers over to the remaindermen, they would now be owners of the property as tenants in common. So that is life estates pretty much in a nutshell. You want to know that homestead law also automatically creates a remainder estate. If the property is owned in severalty, let's say a gentleman buys a bachelor pad, later falls in love, gets married, and moves his new wife into the home. The property, however, continues to be owned in severalty, meaning his name only. If he were to pass away, the wife would have an automatic life estate in the property, a remainder estate, and his children, whether of that marriage or previous marriage or no marriages, just his children as a whole, would be automatically named remaindermen of the property. So that is life estates. Now let's move on to the other aspect of freehold estates, which is fee simple. Again, fee simple absolute. It's the most comprehensive form of ownership, and you either own this property alone, and that's in severalty. There's not a whole lot to that. Owning property, it's severed ownership. I know a lot of students get confused with in severalty. They believe it's several. It is not. In severalty. It's owned by one sole person. And then you have concurrent form of ownerships. There are 3 concurrent forms of ownership. You have tenants in common, joint tenancy, and tenancy by the entireties. I want you guys to concentrate on today the difference between tenants in common and joint tenants. And we'll touch on tenancy by the entireties, but you'll see how tenancy by the entireties fits under joint tenancies. So tenants in common has the right to pass on to your heirs. You could take title with this other person or person, so this is 2 or more people owning concurrent ownership. You can get title at the same or different times in this case. And you can have equal or unequal shares. And your share, one of the co-owner's shares, can be passed on to their family via their will, etc. So let me give you a real life example of tenants in common. And this pops up on the state exam currently. 2 business partners want to go out and buy a property together. One of them passes away, it would go to the family in the case of tenants in common, right? So the question reads somewhere along the line, they want business partners want to develop land together. How would the family, the key word being the family, benefit most under what form of concurrent ownership? And in this case, tenants in common. The family would be protected if one of the co-owners passed away, they would get their share. So let me give you another example, and it kind of brings all of the unities of tenants in common together. Let's say you, student watching this now, has $1 million apartment complex, right? You get a great deal offered to you for investment purposes, but are a little bit tight on liquid at the moment, and you need 200,000. You come and you approach me, hey Jose, I need $200,000 to invest in the stock market, whatever it is that you're looking to invest. You're in need of 200,000. You have this $1 million apartment complex you've already owned for several years. It's worth about $1 million. You tell me, why don't I sell you 20% shares in my apartment complex and bring you on as co-owner? Well, you're adding me on title at a separate time, so we know it's tenants in common. And two, you're only giving me a 20% interest in the ownership. So I don't have to go out and mention that my 20% can go out to my heirs or your 80% in this particular question if you run across it, because just the mere fact that we have separate ownership percentages and title was taken at separate times, we know automatically it's tenants in common. Good way to remember tenants in common: it's the second most common form of ownership outside of tenancy by the entireties, which is husband and wife ownership. Okay, so remember, tenants in common, no right of survivorship, meaning the surviving owner does not take the other owner's share, or the surviving owners take the other owner's shares, right? So we're talking about two or more people. We could be tenants in common with 5 different, and each of us having a separate amount of ownership interest. Okay, so that's tenants in common. Now let's talk about joint tenancy. Joint tenancy does have right of survivorship. So the surviving owners would take the shares of the deceased co-owners. So let's say there was 4 owners that own this property. First thing about joint tenants, like I said, it doesn't have to be equal shares in tenants in common. It must be equal shares when it comes to joint tenancy. So if there's 4 of us, 25% ownership each 4 of the owners. And we must have all taken title at the same time. Okay? So keep that in mind. If you see equal ownership interest title at the same time, it could be joint tenancy. It could also be tenants in common, right? As I talked about. However, if there's ever unequal shares or title being taken at a separate time, that's going to automatically be tenants in common. So one of the 4 co-owners dies. Now the 3 remaining co-owners would be 33% owner of the estate. Now, if it's 2 co-owners left at a 50-50 share, let's say, and one of them passes away, then the other now receives fee simple in severalty. They would be sole owners of the particular property. All right, so who would do joint tenants, right? It's like, I wouldn't do this with probably a sibling if I have children, etc. You want to make sure that whoever you do sign joint tenancy, and the deed must have specific wording in it saying that it is joint tenancy. This was very popular amongst homosexuals. Maybe you're purchasing a property with one of your children or with one of your parents, and you know that upon your death, this is exactly that other owner is where you want the property to go upon your death, right? If my daughter, for example, needed me to co-sign and be put on title for her to qualify to purchase a home, set it up as joint tenants, I'm more than likely going to go hopefully before her, and upon my death, she would be the sole owner of the property. It's a good way to do it as well, because no inheritance tax, I'm just removed. And this is the case when it's tenancy by the entireties, husband and wife. Either one or the other is going to die first, right? Husband probably typically die before the woman does. And upon the husband's death, the wife would now own fee simple in severalty. And this is automatically created when a husband and wife purchase the property during their marriage together, right? So it's automatically created. So that is your forms of freehold estates, right? So we have the life estate, and then we have fee simple, absolute ownership, and it can either be alone in severalty, or we have the three different forms of concurrent ownership. Joint tenancy, no right of survivorship, meaning it passes to your heirs according to your will if you die testate. And then you have your joint tenancy, which must be created in the deed when it is transferred. And then you have tenancy by the entireties, which is automatically created between a husband and wife. Okay, now those are freehold. Let's move on to non-freehold estates, which is a transfer of possession. We'll start with an estate for years, and that's probably the word you'll see on the state exam or on your course exam. It's also referred to as tenancy for years. Now, if you see it as tenancy for years, it would probably be pretty easy to trigger the fact that this is a written lease agreement. We have a lease between landlord and tenant for a specified amount of time. But when you see it as an estate for years, it may be a little bit more difficult to grasp the concept that this is an actual written lease agreement. So an estate for years, fancy word for a written lease agreement. Then we have tenancy at will. Tenancy at will pretty much is we had a begin date, right? We agreed on a set date to begin this agreement for possession, but we have no fixed termination date, such as maybe a month-to-month lease, a month-to-month rental agreement. Really, sorry, I didn't want to use the word lease there. A month-to-month rental agreement. I agreed you were going to be moving in on July 1st, and on the 1st of the month you were going to be paying me $2,000 a month for the townhome I'm renting you. And then we have tenancy at sufferance. Tenancy at sufferance is a holdover. Tenants are in possession of the property without the landlord's consent. For state exam purposes, you can see how this would apply maybe directly from an estate for years to tenancy at sufferance. You have a written lease agreement for a year, it terminates, you're still in the property, you're really tenancy at sufferance up until the point the landlord is okay with you being there, and then it would turn into a tenancy at will. So for example, what I would do with my tenants is I would have an estate for years, bring them in, have them sign a 1-year lease for the rental unit, and when the lease expires, I don't go back and actually have them renew the lease. I just found it's best to keep it on a month-to-month in case I ever wanted to terminate, raise the rents, etc. So it would convert into a tenancy at will once I was okay with it and let them know I'll be picking up the rents for the following month. And it would stay as tenancy at will. Let's say at some point though, I needed possession of the property back. Let's say I wanted to move into this particular property. I give the tenants, in the case where I'm renting the property to them on a month-to-month, 15-day notice is what is required by law, and ask them to move out with 15-day notice, and they don't, then it's tenancy at sufferance. It's a holdover. They're in possession of the property without my consent. I gave them the proper notice, and they continue to occupy the unit. Okay, so again, this is freehold estates versus non-freehold. We ended today's video on non-freehold estates. Again, this is Jose Martinez with First to Pass Real Estate School. I hope you got something out of this. Keep us in mind for our cram courses. We do offer one-on-one private tutoring as well to help you pass the state exam. See you at the next video.